My name's Eric Herman, and I work for MySQL. I got at the 2004 Users Conference, I presented using the existing user-defined function framework that we could do a kind of cheesy hack that would show us that it would be really possible to execute user-defined functions in Java from within the database. And that idea was fun and interesting, but we wanted to have something that would really integrate into the server and be more real, not just a proof of concept. And so we've worked on it in the background over time, and we're now at a point that that using the existing plugin framework that already exists in the server, we're able to demonstrate that we have something that integrates nicely in and looks very much like the SQL standard for external language stored procedures. So it's come to be a lot more real in the last couple of years, and we're hoping to be able to give a demonstration of what we have and where it's going.
What we'd like to know to start off with, just a basic background of obviously developers and DBAs. How many people here have used stored procedures of any kind on any DBMS? So
about half. And how many people are using them right now in their applications? Okay, a few. And how many people are avoiding using them because of some issue on MySQL? So you are good. And just briefly, can you imagine something that you would like to do in a stored procedure, but for whatever reason you're avoiding that one?
So we're using stored procedures to do some reporting financial applications. We're doing that on top of it. And it's causing lots of problems because lots of words are very intensive. It takes quite a while. So replication is pretty easy to do and so on.
So you're experiencing problems with the current stored procedure table locking. Okay.
Some other reasons that people have had issues and things that inspired our work is that the existing stored procedure logic is going to be in a different language than their application logic. That maintaining that means that they have to have it written once in their application and usually again, and they have to keep those two in sync. And so there's some, I guess there's a variety of little things in the existing either user-defined function framework or the existing stored procedure framework that aren't ideal. And ideally, we want to be able to do that in the same language where we're not duplicating the logic, where we can really be accessing the very same code from either application side or from database side. So we can choose where we want that to execute. So, trivial-ish example, but so our notion is that we want to have, in our example here, a sort which doesn't come just by default in the database. We have to write it ourselves. And in our pretend business logic, we have a sort that ignores leading consonants. And so all we deal with are vowels. And so we have some example business logic where we take a string and we convert it to Pig Latin, which, if you're not familiar with that, what it does is it takes the consonants off the front and moves it to the back. And we definitely do not want to, as we're paging through the result set of our long table, we don't want to have to pull the entire result set back client side, sort it there where we already have our business logic, and then page through the results. That clearly doesn't scale. And we could take the opportunity to rewrite that very same logic that we have here in the same language as the rest of our business. We could rewrite that using C in the user-defined, in the current UDF framework. But that means anytime we change our business rules, we have to also change that. So ideally, we want to be able to run this server side and be able to reference the same business logic in our application there. So let's see what that looks like. let's can we move on a little bit larger?
I'll try to set for all.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Clever.
I think that when I change the resolutions, I think it's just
Woo. Okay, so let's just.
Can we just about see what's in there?
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can get this screen a little bit better sized for us. So that's let me get that out of the screen. Okay. Yeah, if you're having trouble seeing, please feel free to come up.
That change in resolution always works.
Okay, so you see here Anthony's about to create the function. And if you've worked with other databases that try to conform to the standard, it's going to look very similar. You see the first thing that we have is what we're going to call it, the function name that we're going to call from the database. And a little bit about what its parameters are. It's going to be in Java. And the important thing here is that we get to plumb this name, we get to connect that to our Java function that we're going to call there. So, okay. And so let's see if we have a table there. Do you want to? No, okay, so let's, and so we're going to create our pretend table. Okay, so this is our faux data set, and normally our regular order bys, we're going to get it in alphabetical order, but in this case, we don't want the B in Bob, we don't want the CHRI, we don't want the CHR in Chris, so we want to sort by the first vowel in that. So here we have, we're going to select the name, and then the Pig Latin version of the name as our first vowel sort from counts, and then we're going to order by that very same. Cool. There we go. All right.
That's why you should drop the function before the demo.
Right. Okay, so teach us to try to practice our presentation. Okay, so there we have it. I mean, it's a trivial example, but here we see that that we're sorting by the vowels: Alice, Eve, Is, Ob, and so we're seeing that that's Java that we're executing from within the server.
One thing which is also very popular for use of is the LAMP stack, where the P stands for Perl. This is actually the most capable of the external language plugins we have developed so far, and we can gradually replace nearly any SQL store procedure with a Perl store procedure. In this case, we have a simple example here where we have a stored procedure which returns a simple result set of by numbers, and the actual Perl function we're using here is one you can obtain online. You can just see the URL there. In Perl, how we have implemented it is that all stored procedures are implemented, all Perl stored procedures are implemented within a Perl module. This is a very just standard .pm per module is to encourage reuse and make it nice and modular. Just go back to the actual demo.
You don't have access to tables from the Java.
Not yet. We just
So the question was,
Whether you can access tables from inside.
okay, so, right, so can you query back into the database from Java? Not yet. That's on the roadmap. We've connector J. We've put the abstraction in for either connecting over the network or connecting from inside the server, and we have not yet finished the connector back into the server. So it's on the roadmap. It's underway. It's not done yet.
okay, what I've done here is just a simple example of a function, which is just a bit like what we have had earlier with the Java function. So we'll just try and show that we can do store procedures for returning result sets.
The heading result set is your extension of the C.
No, it's actually...
The heading result is also
there's actually the SQL standard does not declare how Perl store procedures are to be defined.
No, I mean language, no SQL, they just part of the standard. Dynamic result set is also there.
Yes,
Okay.
that is. It seems a bit odd to have a plural as dynamic result sets, but that's actually declared in the SQL standard to be like that.
That's 2003.
So that is according to the Perl store procedure. You can see it just returns a simple result set. What that sort of procedure does is returns a reference to an array, and the framework just translates it into a simple table like that.
Right. So you've got a hash of keys which turn into column names, and then of course values. And then if you have a hash of hash, you end up with multiple rows of that key value
Is
combination.
that anyone wants to see that? Or?
We show the source code.
Yes, I can.
Didn't quite mean it slide. You find the actual file, specify the path, and then it uses more domain to path the direct path.
Okay. Test times one we saw in the example earlier is this one here. This one here actually just returns.
Okay, so that's from the array.
Yes. There's one here where I actually just transform it into a array containing array of arrays, and that one basically transforms it into a vertical result set.
An array of character pass called name.
In that case, they become numbered.
Okay. The thing also pass names, it made a name like type and all this stuff.
So there you see, it's got the type of front.
Now, this is actually just an array of hash values, or just each, as you see here, each element has a defined value. What is probably a bit more interesting is if you return an array of hashes where each hash has some slightly different data. This one here. How does that get transformed when the user sees it?
And So one of the goals of the Perl module is to try to make the experience very, very natural and intuitive to your Perl developer. So principle of least surprise is definitely something guiding.
So that actually each hash value turns into a row, and in areas where it actually examines every single hash in the array to come out with what are the common column titles, and the elements where there's a no value in that hash, it translates it back into a null value for that column. Yes.
Can I use it to table in the query?
Not yet. That is something which MySQL cannot do at this time. But it's something which I'd like to be able to extend it to do. As soon as table function store is enabled in MySQL to support it for stored procedures, then this will automatically work. As and when that happens. Okay. Here we've just done a discussion about the actual impact of the code. The code is actually designed to be relatively low impact in the actual server code. There's a couple of new files in the actual SQL subdirectory which contains the MySQL D binary. But the important thing we've tried to do in its design is to minimize where you have to change. We changed a little bit in the parser to support the SQL compliant syntax. And we extended the stored procedure implementation to be using all the existing ACL infrastructure, everything within the existing stored procedure implementation, just so that instead of executing the stored procedures, which are what previously happened, it will just call out into the new plugin type for external languages. There's actually a very minor change to the existing system tables. We changed one column in the MySQL.proc table, and that is the language is currently enum. We changed that to a varchar. There's a few minor changes just to protect it to handle recursion, so that when we do have dynamic SQL, it can then call stored procedures again. And there's the biggest amount of work within the change here is actually to support dynamic SQL. In particular, what we had to do is refactor the protocol handling so that both the standard wired network protocol and the embedded protocol are embedded into the server at all times. And when you're doing, when you're performing dynamic SQL, it actually, the communication between the client and server is using the embedded protocol. This is very important because in MySQL you have a transaction context of a session per thread. And by keeping it in this way, that by using the embedded protocol, any dynamic SQL can occur in the same transaction context as the original callee. And by doing that, we mitigate any problems of deadlocking and any other mismatch result problems. So you can actually, as an example, what you can do, you can actually you can commit your transactions from within the stored procedure. You can have a transaction that starts outside the stored procedure and then gets committed within it, or roll back from within the stored procedure. It all happens within the same context. The client library was modified to enable the embedded protocol to the server, and this is actually a very minor change, but a change simple enough so that we can actually use, for example, in Perl stored procedure support, the DVD MySQL can be used completely unmodified. In fact, you can just pick up the DVD MySQL binaries and use them as it is under this framework. No modifications are required in that whatsoever. And for a the developer using it, it just looks like just normal DVD MySQL access to the database.
Right. So for the languages which use the MySQL client library, basically they get this for free. For languages which do not, Java's pure Java implementation doesn't write the library. That's why we have to do some re-implementation there. .NET would be the same way. So.
You're going to store procedures like gain lakes, functions also?
Yes.
But on the other hand, the Java procedure will be in the sandbox can do something related to the server,
I'm sorry.
But Simon said, Java procedure will be in a sandbox, it cannot do anything really bad to the server. Like from the code, we have the same memory space, and you can basically grab the memory and do those tests.
Yes.
Right.
But as regards to how the internals work, as with standard, with any other MySQL standard plugin, we have the init and deinit routines. And then we implement for the actual stored procedure plugins, the implementer has to implement three routines for find or to obtain a handle to the routine, execute that handle, and release that handle. The important distinction is that this detail is completely hidden from users who are end users who are just using these plugins. This is just for implementers who are implementing a stored procedure.
Right. So when you go to implement the Ruby one, which I'm looking forward to seeing, you'll need to know this. But if you're just using it, as your function or your procedure, you don't have to know about this. So this is the API that's there for the language implementers.
Implementing the UDS, for example, using this interface is slightly different from implementing UDS in the old-style UDF framework. In the old-style UDF framework, you are basically given all the data structures for your parameters, and you have to process that data. With our framework, you have a callback interface to retrieve values from the server and to store results back into the server. So its operation is just fundamentally different. Now, this is just an idealized or cleaned up view of what kind of API calls are available. We can actually have a look at how this actually looks with a simple plugin. Because one thing with this interface is it's not just for stored languages or procedural languages. You can actually use it as an interface for, say, wire protocol. In one example I can briefly demonstrate is XMRPC.
XML remote procedure call.
XMRPC is a somewhat popular and simple protocol which allows you to invoke a remote routine on some server and get some results back. This is actually an example. There's a guy hosting an XMRPC example server of which you can send it a number and retrieve back a state name. Actually, demonstrate that.
Just out of curiosity, was that ID arbitrary or was that like order of entry that you?
I have no idea where the ID comes from. We could select them all and make a guess.
I think it's a pig Latin sorting.
It might have been a pig Latin sort, absolutely.
Here, let's get pretty hot.
Oh yeah.
Okay, that's exactly the same statement what I had earlier. And we can actually try invoking it. Anyone want to pick a number other than 40? Or do you want the same number? 37. 37. Oh, I've got a network.
Nice. Oh, open the browser. Open the browser.
Yeah.
Probably have to stupid.
Okay, I'm going to have to fall back to using a notebook. Actually, I don't think I know what may be going on. Yeah. Maybe set up to use a proxy. Just get this.
Let's fall back to the...
Okay, I've got a simple XMRPC server which does the same thing, but it's written in Perl. Okay, it's a simple XMRPC server using the Frontier daemon XMRPC library. It's a very simple server. You see, that's the entire definition of the server. Okay, let's drop that function.
Alright. So, I mean, the kind of fun thing here is that here we have that this isn't file access, this isn't just execution, this is really executing on another system somewhere else, in this case also localhost. But here we are.
I think that one of the things which was used as for the external name is a nice, simple, standard XMRPC identifier. It's nothing special about it.
We want to do the trigger?
Sure.
How about logging and debugging services? And you focus on sending logs on server log?
We can show you triggers you can use for that
There's-
purpose.
More needs to be done there, is the answer.
Would I be able to debug and my program my own data IDE?
Right, right.
And then import it in?
So I've done the debugging session with Java in Eclipse, calling in from. In order to set that up, instantiating the JVM requires some additional parameters, and there's a configuration file for doing that. So there's some options there.
You started with an attach, basically? Like
Yeah.
remote debugging?
Yeah, just like remote debugging for Apache, for Tomcat.
For a simple example of a possible use case for this is consider we've got a simple table where we have a couple of columns and we have this simple trigger here which we'll call the XMRPC routine. Now, let's have a value of 10. Anyone wants to give a value to 42? 42?
Oh, it's just for the same. You asked the right question.
Yeah? You would.
Let's try. One thing you have to sort out better is error handling the XMRPC. If it's somehow had some kind of connection error, it can do strange things.
But the proof of concept here is that the trigger has been created, and so when we do an insert, we're only inserting into the ID field, but that insert is calling the trigger, which is calling the remote procedure, which is updating the state name field on the table.
Now, in the case of the remote logging, in a hypothetical case, it may be possible, although I haven't tested it, that you can back a log table with, say, the black hole engine and attach a trigger to it to fire out to an external routine. That is a possible way to use that. But I haven't tested if triggers work in the table logging.
Yeah. So, but more needs to happen in terms of logging and error handling. I And that's something that at this time, that's a known area where more work needs to be done, especially to expose that and make that friendly to plugin developers. So.
Oh, yes. As part of this demo, I'd like to give a very quick walk through the XMRPC source code to illustrate that it is not a nightmare to implement one of these, if you were to want to implement your own plugin.
So, actually, let's find out. So, how many people here have an interest in implementing a new language? So I would like to see. Okay, so you'd like to see some of that. Okay.
You said implementing. You meant see implemented or actually
right?
Implement? Oh, I'd like to see some. I'm not capable of writing one, but
okay. So let's do that. A quick look.
Okay. As with any MySQL plugin, with the new plugin thing, you have to have a descriptor. This here is the actual descriptor for the XMRPC plugin. You can see that we have a new plugin type called MySQL ExtLangStoredProc plugin, and then the rest of it looks pretty much what you expect. We have just one of the differences is the descriptor here. That is actually a structure up here where, like I said earlier, you have to find, routine, release, and then the execute. Of course, like for any plugin, you have the init and deinit. The init is fairly simple for the XMRPC case. It's just initializing the XMRPC library. It's a standard XMRPC library I've downloaded off the web. And after that, you need to actually find the routine in this case up here. What you have to do is return a handle which the MySQL server will use again when it wants to actually execute that routine. This is actually amortized the cost so that if you had to hit the same routine many times, you're not always constantly asking the system to actually find that routine again. This is particularly effective for languages such as Java or Perl. It allows caching to occur, and it's generally a good thing. In this case, the actual execution here, we parse the URL and feed that result to find the actual XMRPC reference. We allocate a very small memory structure to actually store that value before we return that to the MySQL server. And in the other hand, we have the release routine just to basically release that value and feed the memory. So that you see is very, very simple. We also have the exec routine, which has to build the parameter list and then execute the XMRPC and then store the result set before returning it to the server.
So the store the result set there is the part where we're calling back into the framework that's going to allow MySQL to return that ultimately back to the client.
How do you pass down the argument?
I'll just come to that in a second. We have a very simple callback interface. So if I just go to the bottom of this. Here we have the build parameter routine, which you saw being called earlier. In this case, for XMRPC library, you have to build an array and populate that array before feeding it to the procedure call. In this case, when you execute any MySQL store procedure under this framework, you get an argument list of how many arguments there are, and then you can retrieve the value, and then in this case for XMRPC, we append it to the list. To retrieve the value, there's a small suite of routines.
We'll talk a little bit about the PSM context after.
Yeah, the PSM context is a simple C struct which contains information useful for the execution of stored routines. It contains a value of how many arguments of the routine is being called with, and it contains a pointer to a set of callback functions, of which you can see here we have a callback function to check if a field contains no value, for example. And also we can have another one which tells obtains the field type, of which you can then use that to, in the case for if it's a long value, for example, we can retrieve the integer value of that field. And of course there's values for doubles, and there's actually we also want here for string handling.
So this is something that's a stronger feature than the existing UDF framework, is being able to have a better view into the type system and not just be dealing with values that have been marshaled in the strings.
Not shown in this example, there are more complex examples of handling larger binary types, but yeah, the general idea on this one. For returning the results to the users, we have the store result function here, which I implemented right. I'll briefly go through how a simple result is returned before a stored function. In this case, we call the store integer, for example, routine with an index value of -1, and that is how simple results return for functions. This can also be used, for example, for stored procedures where you have in-out or out parameters, where you can actually specify your parameter value that you want to return the value into.
And also support now and out.
Yes. Yeah. So we're looking at the time. I think we should jump ahead. For people who are interested in this, we're definitely going to be around. We can have a one-on-one or a small group to dig into this. Go ahead.
Because we're using the existing MySQL stored procedure framework, all created stored procedures are subject to control by the existing branch revoke framework, so you can actually moderate what users can run. This is different from UDFs, where everyone can run all UDFs in the old legacy framework. This one here, you have a bit of control. What isn't done yet is any controls to limit which stored procedure plugin they're able to access, because that requires adding to the ACL framework. So that has not been implemented by this code.
Right, and that's beyond the intended scope for now. If this becomes mainstream into the server, that will be something that we'll talk about. Does it make sense to extend the ACL framework for that? But we're not going to work on that.
In what languages you can have a reasonable sandbox besides Java?
Well, in this framework, all languages must be responsible for their own sandbox.
Yeah,
Java has it.
Let's say
Perl,
in what languages you can have a reasonable sandbox?
you can actually sandbox even Perl, but you have to control what Perl modules people have access to. A lot of the standard Perl modules allow people far too much control.
So there's so something we don't yet support is fenced, which means it's not operating in the same address space.
You have it in Java.
Excuse me?
You have it in Java.
Well, right.
Java gets it for free.
Right. But that is part of the external language stored procedure definition, is the ability to declare it fenced or not. We don't yet support that.
We don't support any aggregate functions yet. If you want aggregate functions, you are basically stuck with UDFs as they currently exist.
Is anybody here using aggregate UDFs? You are.
Part of the reason for why we haven't implemented it is because there's no language in the actual SQL standard specification on how to declare an aggregate function. Now, even people using DB2 have to resort to interesting measures in order to do aggregate style functions. And if anyone's really interested, I have a demonstration on my MySQL blog which shows an aggregate style Perl stored procedure using the existing framework as it exists today. We've not yet delivered a fully working adapter to allow existing UDFs of non-aggregate type to plug into our...
I just remember whether you can declare aggregate routine in the standard.
Aggregates are not supported in any way in the standard.
Or we talked about in process.
Yeah. The code, if anyone's interested, is available to download today. That is the URL where we have one of our repositories. I've got other side repositories why I do experimental changes. I'm sure Ed is going to do similar things.
This is Launchpad. So this is from the Forge page. If you go to the External Language Stored Procedure project on Forge, there is a link to this, absolutely. But the source itself is being hosted at Launchpad.
We've had to move the sources outside of where it was previously hosted on the MySQL internal systems, part because I no longer have access to those systems as... Yeah.
So, and I mean, it allows us to have community contributors. Is
Yeah.
the biggest thing. Is that of the current committers, two are MySQL employees and one's a Google employee. So.
And by chance, plugin adapter, I mean universal for all the layers.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, that's the plan.
What's that WL?
Yes.
Well, that work log, it's a MySQL internal thing. When we come up with feature ideas, they get a work log number, and they get prioritized in the roadmap.
And you can go to Forge and click the work log link and type in this number and it will live.
So,
On the list of things which we have ideas for, or which are planned features for the near future, is a Type 2 connected API, so we can...
yeah, so we talked about that. So allowing you to make queries back into the server within the same thread context so you don't deadlock on yourself. So that's on its way. I wasn't able to deliver it at a conference.
Another thing which actually Arjun wanted me to do is a Lua stored procedure implementation. I started messing about with that on Monday, and I hadn't had time because I had wanted to finalize this presentation, but I hope to be able to deliver something very soon.
Do you need to send both Lua or was it the design from Reddit to design?
Lua, you're at the mercy of what Lua libraries you have access to. So the more libraries you give the user, for example, is the file library, of course the user's going to have more access. So it depends on how much you give the user to play with.
And of course, C comes by default, right? You can always write your functions in C using the framework as well.
I can actually show a very, very simple C store procedure.
Let's get that.
If anyone's interested, just ask me, I can show it. Have you got enough time for questions?
Yeah, we have just a few minutes. I know that you guys are probably starving, but it's 12:40 right now. Go ahead.
How do you handle the interruptions that come from the servers? For example, let's say you have a long-running Java procedure. Can the server somehow have a signal that it needs to be interrupted, say for the server check?
There is a mechanism which can be used to indicate to a stored procedure that it needs to terminate. It's called thread kill or killed. It depends on what libraries do check. For example, on XMRPC, there actually is a part in it which tries to register a routine to detect if the kill had been set. Okay.
But I think the short answer is that that's not well supported.
It's up to the plugin implementer to do it.
Right, and so for the Java one, for instance, it's not there.
Well, you probably prepare a model that provide give you an ability to process and pass asynchronous signals, and you deliver via that, and you can have something like that in Java.
Yeah.
It's more to provide the kill procedure, otherwise one can try to.
Yeah. In this case, what we have here is, for example, if the user has a user account, the user can have a user account, and the user can have a user account. So the user can have a user account, and the user can have a user account. So I've extended the API a tiny little bit so that we can return a pointer to where the third kill variable is. But it's up to the plugin implementer to examine that value to see if it should terminate the execution.
That's another question.
Okay, I know that the Java virtual machine uses a lot of signal handlers. How do you plan to tackle that problem? Because MySQL also uses a lot of signal.
There's a flag you can run most JVMs with, especially the Sun one, called reduce signals, something like that.
I think the short answer is that that in the short term we're not going to be addressing that, and in the longer term, fenced will mean even though Java has a sandbox, but running it fenced will be a different address space. So I think there's some options there. But that's not high on our radar. Yes, Timo.
So these table procedures which are not yet table functions was things to be frequent. So do they take inputs? I think I missed that they showed.
Yes.
The table functions take inputs.
Well, table functions can take inputs. That is declared. Oh, we don't. We implement store procedures, yes, but we don't actually implement table functions, although they are declared by the spec. We're kind of waiting for the MySQL server to implement.
Yeah, but your current implementation, if I just use the code inputs, can I supply parameters to
Yes.
your table storage procedure? Okay, let's call it.
Yes, you can provide parameters you can provide in parameters, out parameters, and in-out parameters.
I thought you were saying, well, before the presentation, that you can only do such procedures with functions in Perl.
You can do functions and procedures in
Perl.
Perl.
If you access a table from a function, then...
Are you talking about doing dynamic SQL? Or
it's kind of true. But if you access a table from a search function, then you could easily get it there.
Currently, how the frameworks currently how the MySQL internal store procedures are defined, do not actively support the use of store functions to have dynamic SQL. However, for a store procedure, you can perform dynamic SQL.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, but you can still write third function in Perl and use the DBI as a table.
Once MySQL allows a way for sensible table locking, yes.
Right, I know the problem. I know the real problem. I'm just asking whether you just say, whether your answer is, okay, you can look at it, you just don't support it, or you have actually some protection.
It will not allow you at this time to do it. If you call
you don't
DBI...
You don't allow DBI from the function?
If you attempt to call DBI to create a connection handle from the store function, you will get an undef value back or never.
Okay.
Also, on the create procedure statement, if you declare a create procedure with the words no SQL, again you will get an error.
Okay.
If you say reads SQL data, you'll get a connection of which you can only perform reads. You will not be able to update anything. Only if you want to modify SQL data, you have to use the words modified SQL data on create procedure syntax in order to get a full read-write connection. Any other?
All right. I think people want to eat.
Yes.
Thank you.